They said no decent man would buy a woman, but he wasn't buying a woman, he was saving a life. Out where the wind ran louder than the people, and the prairie sky stretched wider than most hearts could bear, lived a man named Silas Boone, a rancher carved from silence, grief, and too many winters alone. He had a barn with broken hinges, a stovetop that rattled when it boiled, and a porch swing that hadn't moved since his wife passed 5 years back. He didn't drink, didn't laugh, didn't expect miracles, until the day he won a poker hand he hadn't meant to play, and the pot was a girl. Not a barmaid, not a bet, a pregnant girl, 17, wrapped in threadbare shawl and eyes too tired for her age. Her name was Clara, and she wasn't there by choice. Her own mother had handed her over like a sack of flour just to settle a debt. She's used to chores, the woman said, as if that was enough to forget the rest. The men laughed, but Silas didn't. He paid, he signed, he walked her out without a word. And from that moment on, nothing about his quiet little ranch was the same. He didn't touch her, didn't speak much, just made sure she had stew on the table and blankets by the fire. He was no saint, just a man who knew what it was like to be abandoned when you needed someone most. And Clara, she was no fragile thing, but she'd never known kindness without strings. So when she looked at him, this quiet man with eyes that didn't wander and hands that never clenched, she didn't know what to do with that. Not yet. But maybe that's where love sometimes begins. Not in courtship, not in kisses, but in warmth that asks nothing in return. Have you ever felt saved not by words but by someone's quiet presence? This is a story of broken beginnings and the miracle that followed. Stay with us, because sometimes the person they threw away becomes the answer someone else was praying for. Out on the edge of Wyoming territory, where wind whispered secrets across the grasslands and silence stretched longer than the horizon, lived a man named Silas McGraw. A widowed rancher in his late 40s, Silas spoke, little smiled less, and carried his sorrow like an old saddle worn but still holding tight. He wasn't cruel, just tired. His wife Maren had passed 5 winters before. Since then the house had gone quiet. No children ever came. The earth had never gifted them that. Only chores dust and days that looked the same from dawn to dusk. Then one morning he received a letter. A trader passing through Cheyenne mentioned something unusual. A young woman, pregnant, sold by her own mother for a sum of money no larger than a saddle horse. Girl needs a place, the man wrote. You've got one. Silas read the letter twice, then again. He didn't know what possessed him to send the reply. Maybe it was the memory of his wife's hands when she used to fold bread dough, or the sound of a child's cry that never came in his home. Or maybe it was the thought that no human being deserved to be bartered like stock. So he waited, and 2 weeks later she arrived. Her name was Clara. She couldn't have been more than 17. Slim, pale, and visibly pregnant belly round beneath a faded cotton dress. Her eyes didn't meet his at first. She stepped off the wagon like a shadow, quiet, careful, and exhausted, in a way only women with no say in their lives ever looked. No one had packed her things. She had only a small satchel of comb and a chipped porcelain angel clutched in her palm. Silas didn't say much. He just offered his hand and said softly, "You can rest here." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. That night he made her a cot in the room that once belonged to his wife. He brought warm stew, left the fire lit, and let her sleep without questions. Outside, coyotes howled beneath the moon. Inside, 2 strangers sat on opposite ends of a house, both haunted, both silent. And yet, something passed between them that night. Not romance, not even kindness, just a breath of stillness that said, "I don't know what you've been through, but you're safe now." Have you ever felt like you arrived somewhere, not because you were wanted, but because there was nowhere else to go? Clara didn't come looking for love. She came because she had no other choice. But what happens when a man who thought he was too broken to care begins to notice the small ways she refuses to break? Clara spent the first few days barely speaking. She rose with the sun always before Silas and quietly swept the porch even when it didn't need sweeping. She boiled water without being asked. She ate in small bites. Her hands never stopped fidgeting, folding, refolding, tucking hair behind her ear, smoothing her dress. She was used to being invisible, but Silas, despite all his silence, noticed everything. He noticed how she flinched at loud noises, how she never asked for seconds even when her stomach growled, how she folded her nightgown with exact corners and left it under her pillow each morning. She didn't act like a child, though she was barely grown. She acted like someone who had been taught to earn every breath she took. Silas kept his distance. He worked long hours on the field, but came in each evening to check the fire, bring her hot tea and offer quiet words that expected nothing in return. He never asked about the father, never asked about her mother. He knew too well the kind of pain that buries its story deep under layers of dust and dignity. One night Clara finally spoke. It was just after supper. She had finished drying the dishes and was standing near the fire watching the flame sway. "My mama said I was born wrong," she said softly. "Too quiet, too soft," said a girl with no steel in her spine won't survive. Silas set down his cup. He didn't interrupt. "She told me to marry the man who got me pregnant. But when he saw I was expecting, he ran. Mama said that made me useless. Said I had to repay the debt I cost her. So she sold me." Silas felt something heavy shift in his chest. Not anger, not pity, just grief. He nodded slowly. "You didn't deserve that." She looked up, eyes wide, like no one had ever said those words before. "You don't have to be useful to be worthy," he added quietly. Clara didn't reply, but she stood a little straighter that night. What happens when someone who has only known transactions is offered dignity instead? And what if the one offering it doesn't even realize he's beginning to heal too? The days grew colder. Autumn settled on the plains with a hushed, dry wind, rust-coloured leaves, and the scent of firewood splitting in the yard. Silas chopped wood with a rhythm that steadied his thoughts. Clara now, 7 months along, moved slower, but she still tried to sweep, still folded his shirts when they dried, still kept her head low even when no one was watching. One afternoon he found her in the barn, standing with her hands against the wall, crying silently. He didn't rush in. He simply stood a few steps away, waiting. "I'm sorry," she said between breaths, not turning around. "I try not to do that here." Silas stepped closer. "You don't have to apologize for crying." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "It's just, I don't know what kind of mother I'll be. I wasn't raised to be soft." Silas thought about that, then spoke gently. Being soft and being strong don't have to live in separate rooms. She turned, arms folded tight over her belly. "What if I mess it up?" He gave a small, worn smile. "Then we try again the next day. That's what parents do." She looked at him, startled. Silas didn't answer right away, but something changed in his eyes. "You're not alone anymore, Clara." She wanted to believe that, but later that night she overheard the townsfolk talking. While picking up flour from the store, Silas had run into Walter Kemp, the kind who never whispered when he should. "You're really keeping that girl." Walter chuckled loud enough for everyone, carrying someone else's mess and walking around like she owns the ranch. Silas didn't respond, but Clara had heard enough. She returned home quiet, her jaw tight. That evening she didn't join him for dinner. Instead, she sat in the dark of her room, one hand over her belly, whispering to the child inside her. "I don't know if we're wanted. Not really. And I don't know if this place is safe when the world still sees us as something broken." A part of her wanted to pack up and leave, but where another part whispered stay. But staying meant risking hope, and hope was a dangerous thing for someone who'd only known doors closing. Can two people learn to trust in a world that keeps trying to convince them they don't belong, when judgment knocks louder than kindness? Will Clara retreat or rise? The first frost came early that year. Clara was bundled in a shawl Silas had left on her chair without a word. It still smelled faintly of pine and hay, warm in a way she wasn't used to. She hadn't spoken much since the whispers in town, but Silas didn't push. He just let her be showing his care through the small things, fresh kindling by the stove, extra slices of bread left on her plate, a steady presence that never demanded anything in return. Then came the morning that changed everything. Clara had gone into labour. It started just before sunrise with pain that gripped her like a storm. Silas had already hitched the wagon and was headed toward the far end of the ranch when he saw her on the porch, bent over, one hand braced on the rail. He jumped down before the horse stopped moving. She couldn't speak, just looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I've got you," he said. He carried her back inside. She didn't resist, didn't argue. She just held onto his shirt with shaking hands. The next hours were long. Silas had delivered calves and colts before, but this was something else. Clara's pain came in waves, and Silas sat beside her, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, whispering, "Breathe." "I'm here." She cried out once, clutching the sheets. I can't do this." He leaned close, gripping her hand. "Yes, you can. Clara, you've already done the hardest part. You stayed." Something inside her broke free then. Not just the fear, not just the pain, but a dam of shame she'd carried since the day she found herself pregnant. She pushed, and with one last cry, stronger than she knew, she had a baby boy entered the world. Tiny, red-faced, furious, but healthy. Clara looked at him, sobbing, laughing all at once. He's real," she whispered. Silas wrapped the child in a towel, trembling. "You both are." He placed the baby in her arms and stepped back, eyes wet, not from fear, not from duty, but awe. In the quiet that followed, Clara whispered, "You didn't have to stay." Silas met her eyes. "I didn't, but I wanted to." What happens when the thing you feared most, letting someone in, leads to the miracle you never thought you'd see? And what if the real birth wasn't just of a child, but of hope? From the moment Clara stepped off that wagon, carrying a child and a silence heavier than any suitcase, to now holding her newborn in trembling arms. What have you felt along this journey? Was it sorrow when she was sold like a burden? Relief when Silas held her hand through the pain? Or maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something gentler, a belief that healing doesn't always need grand words, just someone willing to stay. But now that the baby is born, what happens next? Can Clara truly trust this peace to last, or is the world still waiting to remind her she doesn't belong? Stay with us, because sometimes the hardest part isn't survival, it's believing you deserve what comes after. For 3 weeks the ranch was the quietest it had ever been. The baby, named Samuel after Silas's grandfather, slept, tucked in a cradle made from a barrel Silas had sanded down smooth. Clara rocked him each night, humming old lullabies she didn't even realize she remembered. Silas, true to his word, gave her space but not distance. He brought her tea in the evenings, fixed the roof over the nursery without a word, and once on a cold morning left her a folded note that simply read, "You're not alone anymore." But peace, as Clara would learn, has a way of making the past knock louder. The letter came in the middle of a windy afternoon, delivered by a boy on horseback who didn't even get down from the saddle. Just held it out, smirked, and said, "Guess she's not forgotten." Clara opened it with trembling fingers. It was from her mother. "I heard you've given birth. I trust the man you've shacked up with is decent. I could use help at the house now that winter's come. If you've come to your senses, you're welcome back. Bring the child. There's work to be done." There was no warmth, no apology, not even a name, just a demand coated in self-interest. Clara stared at the words until they blurred. For a moment all the old feelings came rushing back, that she was property, not a person, that her worth was measured in how obedient she was, that maybe she didn't deserve this quiet little life Silas had begun to build with her. She didn't tell him about the letter at first, but he noticed. "You've been quiet," he said gently that night as she fed the baby by firelight. Clara looked down, didn't realize I had permission to be loud. He smiled softly, not as a joke, but as understanding. "You've always had permission, Clara. You just didn't have safety." She bit her lip, then handed him the letter. He read it, and he didn't get angry, didn't speak right away. He just folded it back up, set it on the hearth, and placed a match to it. The fire ate through the paper fast, and still he said nothing. But when he turned to her, his voice was low and steady. "You're not someone's returnable mistake." Clara's eyes welled. "Why do you stay so gentle with me?" "Because someone should have been," he said. "Long before I came along. What do we do with love we're told we don't deserve? Can a woman who's only ever known duty finally learn to accept devotion? The snow came early that year. Fat, slow flakes drifted down over the fields like the land had finally decided to hush itself. Samuel was nearly 2 months old now, with wide brown eyes and a habit of grabbing Clara's finger, as if it were the only anchor he trusted. She wore motherhood quietly, the way she'd learned to wear everything, without complaint, but with a kind of deep-rooted steadiness that took Silas's breath away when she didn't notice. One morning, as they sat by the fire after chores, Silas asked her softly, "Have you thought about his name?" Clara blinked. "You named him. Samuel." He nodded. "I did. But he's yours first. Maybe there's something you want to give him that isn't borrowed from my past." She looked at the baby in her arms, thought about the world he'd grow up in. Then after a pause she whispered, "His middle name, Josephine, after my grandmother, the only one who ever told me I was worth more than my quiet." Silas smiled. "Then that's who he is." That same week the town sent word. A small private chapel was opening its doors for winter blessings. Folks were invited to come to bring newborns, share warm cider, and offer up prayers for the season ahead. Clara hesitated. She'd stayed hidden so long. People in town still whispered. She wasn't a wife. The child was illegitimate. And Silas, well, he was the man who bought her, wasn't he? That's what they'd say. But then came the night she saw herself clearly. She'd taken a lamp to the barn to check the goats and caught her reflection in the window. There she stood in boots covered in hay, a baby sling across her chest, wind in her hair. And she didn't look broken. She looked alive. She went to the chapel that Sunday, holding Samuel tight, walking beside Silas with her head high. People stared, of course. But one old woman smiled, warm-wrinkled, and said, "Strong-looking boy." Clara smiled back. "He'll need to be. His mama is too." Sometimes freedom doesn't come with a shout, but a name spoken aloud without shame. But when the world begins to accept her, can Clara accept it back? By the time the snow melted into mud and the wind softened enough to carry the scent of pine, Clara had carved out a rhythm that felt almost like peace. She still woke early, fed the chickens, checked on Samuel, now fat-cheeked and giggly, his baby laugh like bells in an empty church. But it wasn't just routine. Something had shifted inside her, not loudly, not overnight, but like frost leaving the edges of a window 1 inch at a time. One morning, while hanging laundry, she saw Silas standing beneath the old cottonwood. He was carving something with his pocket knife quiet-focused. She walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" she asked. He held up a small wooden sign, carefully smoothed and sanded. On it, carved by hand, were the words Clara's Grove. Below it, a smaller line, Where Things Bloom Again. "I thought you might want a garden here," he said. "A place that's yours, not borrowed." Clara touched the wood with trembling fingers. "No one's ever named a piece of land after me." "You didn't have to be named after the land," Silas said softly. "You just had to belong somewhere." That night, as stars dusted the sky, and Samuel slept between them in his crib, Silas turned to her. "I never asked you proper," he said, voice low. "Didn't seem right the way you came here. But I would now, if you'd let me." Clara didn't answer right away. She just reached for his hand and whispered, "Not because I need saving, but because you stayed long enough to see me." "Yes." They married quietly in spring beneath the cottonwood tree. No one threw rice, no fancy dress. Just a clean dress, a warm breeze, and 2 people who'd stopped apologizing for being alive. And as the baby cooed beside them, Clara smiled, not because the world had finally accepted her, but because she had accepted herself. Out on that quiet patch of prairie beneath a sky that once watched Clara arrive with nothing but fear and a swollen belly, something beautiful took root. Not fast, not loud, but steady. She wasn't rescued with grand gestures. She was received with respect. And that changed everything. Silas never once asked her to forget her pain. He simply made room beside it. And over time, that room became a home, for the child she carried, for the woman she became, and for the love she never thought she deserved. Sometimes the people life discards, the ones labelled too used, too broken, too late, are the very souls love was waiting on all along. Maybe that's the quiet lesson we can take with us today. That kindness doesn't fix the past, but it plants seeds for something better ahead. If this story touched your heart, would you let us know, share a comment? Have you ever been surprised by love even after loss? Do you want to hear more stories like Clara and Silas? And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. We tell the stories that whisper where others shout, stories for the soul, and for those who still believe it's never too late to be seen. Because out here in the West, and maybe in life, the quietest miracles are the ones we carry with us the longest.